Today is 26th September. I'm still in Malaysia, attending the conference here and with my friend and colleague Alex Christoforou. Yesterday, when I did my program, I said that more than likely it would not be as long as some of my programs usually are. In the event, time sped by and the program turned out to be, well, close to its usual size. I cannot make the promise that this video will be of the same length as yesterday's. Firstly, it's later and there are time constraints, many time constraints, and well, I will do the best I can, cover as much as the information as I can over the next time, and we'll see how far I go. But anyway, let's get on with today's video and discuss what's happening, especially as I said, time might not be entirely, well, it might not be as long as I would like it to be. So let's first of all begin by talking about the situation briefly on the Israel-Lebanon border. There are continuous fire assaults by each side, Hezbollah and Israel, against the other. There are reports that Prime Minister Netanyahu has essentially confirmed that Israel will continue the operations against Hezbollah pretty much indefinitely. From what I can understand, he certainly didn't suggest that there would be any end point to them. There are also reports that Israel has called up 2 more brigades. So there would be presumably 3 brigades of Israeli troops concentrated in the area just on the south of the border, which might point to a ground offensive against Hezbollah being prepared. But what I would say is that 3 brigades, I don't know what the size of Israeli brigades are, but let's assume there's 4,000 men each. That would be a force of 12,000 men altogether. I doubt that in itself would be sufficient to break through Hezbollah's defenses. However, it may be that the Israeli intention is to mobilize more troops after the bombing operation has been completed and the Hezbollah targets have been destroyed. We'll just have to see. As for Hezbollah's attacks, again, I'm not in a position to assess their strength and their effectiveness, but it's clear that a lot of Hezbollah rockets are being launched into Israel every day. And obviously, Israeli air defenses are shooting down many of these missiles, though perhaps not all of them. But given that Hezbollah is apparently launching hundreds of missiles each day, and I read a report somewhere that one of the Hezbollah missile and rocket strikes was the biggest missile and rocket strike that the group has launched against Israel since the events of October last year. Well, there will come a point when Israel itself starts to run short of air defense missiles, provided, of course, Hezbollah is able to sustain this sort of barrage. So that's a point to bear in mind, and it may be, given the political effect on Israel of mass missile and rocket attacks, if there are depleted air defenses, that could itself result in a limit to the length of time that this operation, any Israeli operation, can be conducted. I say that because, as I said, Prime Minister Netanyahu gives the impression of an open-ended operation. It might not be possible to do that. And I understand also that the Israeli economy is again facing strains as a result of this conflict on the Israel-Lebanon border. Of course, the Israeli airstrikes, for their part, continue to do significant damage to Hezbollah, but also to Lebanon itself. And I suspect that one of the purposes of the Israeli strikes on Hezbollah and on Lebanon is to increase strained tensions between Hezbollah and the various communities in Lebanon who are in effect caught in the crossfire of these attacks, and also probably to increase tensions between Hezbollah and Iran, with many officials, people within Hezbollah, supporters of Hezbollah, becoming increasingly angry that Iran is not taking action to support Hezbollah at this particular time. Now, I have to make one further observation, which is that last week we saw a whole succession of setbacks that Hezbollah suffered. Firstly, there was the successful pager attack by the Israelis. I understand that most of the victims of that attack were civilian personnel of Hezbollah rather than military personnel and fighters. That's what I've read. I'm not absolutely sure it's true, but anyway, that is what I've read. And of course, alongside that attack, the Israelis were also able to kill a prominent Hezbollah commander and his staff. And early this morning, I saw a report that a second important Hezbollah commander has also been killed in these Israeli strikes. And it does seem that Israel has succeeded in penetrating Hezbollah's security. It's managed either to infiltrate agents into Hezbollah's organization, or perhaps they've been able to decrypt some of Hezbollah's internal messages. And I think the fact that that has happened must at least open the possibility that if there is an Israeli ground attack, Israel will have prepared much more carefully for it than they did when they last fought Hezbollah back in 2006, and that the result of this may be that the Israelis have the military advantage over Hezbollah to an extent that they did not during their last battle in 2006. Now, that's something that I think at the moment remains unproved. We won't know how strong Hezbollah resistance will be unless and until Israeli ground forces go into action. But I think it is a possibility that we need to keep in mind. Anyway, that is all I'm going to say about this conflict at the moment. I've already made clear my own personal views, that this is, again, Israel taking the wrong direction. Even if Israel is successful in defeating Hezbollah, and one wonders how victory against an organization like Hezbollah is defined or measured. I think that in the long term, in the not so long term, like every other victory, military victory, that Israel has achieved, certainly since the 1973 war, all that is going to do is compound Israel's already profound and worsening security problems. I remain firmly of the view that a diplomatic approach would make a lot more sense for Israel. Of course, a lot of time and a lot of goodwill has been lost since the events of October last year. I am choosing my words extremely carefully at this point. Some would put it much more strongly than I have just done. But anyway, that is my view. I wonder whether this is the correct strategy, even if one takes a completely cold-blooded approach to this. I would have thought that a diplomatic and political strategy working on the support Israel still has amongst the Western powers would have served Israel's interests better. But anyway, that is all I'm going to say. Lots of people are dying. Each death is, of course, a tragedy, a great tragedy. I'm not convinced that this is the correct approach at all, but we will have to see how the events over the next few days and weeks play out, and whether the Israelis are indeed planning and are prepared to risk a ground operation in South Lebanon, territory where they have never so far been particularly successful, at least not in the recent past. Anyway, let us now move to the other perennial topic of these videos, which is the situation in Ukraine. And of course, tomorrow, well, over the course of today, to be more precise, President Biden and President Zelensky are due to meet and to have their meeting. We'll see what comes of that meeting. But I am starting to get the very strong impression that President Zelensky, even as he addresses the UN Security Council, as he has done, and even as he addresses the UN General Assembly, that he has massively overplayed his hand. There's a series of articles have appeared in the American media, specifically one in Bloomberg, which says that Western officials who have seen his so-called victory plan are unimpressed by it. They have not seen anything particularly new. I've seen it described more as a wish list than a plan, which is probably true, in fact definitely true. And anyway, the victory plan appears to have impressed no one, at least no one that I know of. And I noticed that the Pentagon spokesman and Admiral Kirby at the US National Security Council have both appeared to reaffirm US policy that long-range missiles should not, at least American long-range missiles, should not be used against Russia. That they said that the prohibition that the United States has imposed against using these long-range missiles for deep strikes against Russia, that prohibition remains in place. Now, of course, that's prior to the meeting with President Biden tomorrow. But I can't help but think that President Zelensky, who's presumably aware of these articles in Bloomberg, which appear to cast cold water on his victory plan, and who's presumably also aware of these statements by these US officials about deep strikes on Russia, that he must be going into his meeting with Biden less sure that he will get the permission, or rather that he will get the agreement for the deep strikes against Russia that he was perhaps hoping for and perhaps even expecting. This is despite the fact that he continues to get strong support from the British specifically on this very same issue. He's also been informed that his meeting, or hoped for meeting, with Donald Trump is not going to take place. Apparently Donald Trump is too busy with the election to meet him. I think Donald Trump does not want to be put in a difficult position of meeting with Zelensky just shortly after Trump himself made comments at an election rally that the United States needed to get out of Ukraine, that Biden and his vice president, Kamala Harris, have brought the United States into the war in Ukraine, and they don't seem to have a clear plan for how to get out of it. So having made comments like that, I can understand that former President Trump does not want to meet Zelensky. He doesn't want to have a row with Zelensky on the one hand, and he doesn't want to make commitments to support Ukraine on the other, which would now appear to contradict his declared policy. So it could be the case that the doors in the United States, in New York specifically, are closing, that Zelensky is knocking on the doors, but he's either finding that they're not opening or that he's let in and then escorted out again, and that the doors are being closed behind him. And there was even a report today, I think it was again in Bloomberg, but it might have been in Reuters or somewhere else, I'm not absolutely sure, that some Western governments, we're not told which Western governments, are now very keen to start getting some kind of negotiation or diplomacy up and running to find some way to bring this conflict in Ukraine to some kind of proper negotiated diplomatic end, and that they're trying to think of ways to reach out to the Russians, with some suggestions that there might be an attempt to reach out to President Putin himself at the forthcoming G20 summit in Brazil. Now, whether that actually does happen, whether these discussions are even taking place, of course, we only have information about that from the media. It could be wrong, but anyway, for the moment at least, it looks as if Zelensky's attempts to consolidate Western support and indeed to get commitments from the Western powers on NATO, Ukraine's NATO membership, and on permission to use long-range missiles against Russia, that all of these plans are failing. For the moment, as I said, the doors appear to be closing in his face. Anyway, we will see. I would finish by saying that if this does remain the case, and I have to say that I thought his speech to the UN Security Council, in which he again essentially reiterated his own position and what is officially Ukraine's position, he still appeared to want what he called a diplomatic solution, but one achieved without negotiations. The Guardian earlier today was saying that his strategy is to try to get the global south to turn on Russia and to browbeat or bully the Russians into capitulating, which seems to me a forlorn hope, to put it mildly. Well, I think this strange behavior, this defiant behavior from President Zelensky almost certainly means that the doors are not just going to be closing in New York and Washington, but they're going to be closing on him around most of the world as well. He is at a serious risk, to put it mildly, of appearing intransigent and completely out of touch with the actual situation in Ukraine. And if his objective, as I suggested in my two last videos, is to get from the West a reaffirmation, a restatement of support for him personally, so that he can face down his opponents in Kiev and keep the Western powers committed in their support, both for him and for Ukraine in this war, well, I think that perhaps he might end up achieving the opposite, doing what I suggested might happen 2 videos ago, which is convince everybody that he is impossible, that his stance is impossible and completely unrealistic, and that whatever the risks of instability in Kiev, the time might have come for the Western powers and for President Zelensky's opponents in Ukraine to agree that the time has come for him to go. Just saying. Anyway, this could quite easily, or so it seems to me, this trip could turn out for Zelensky into a diplomatic disaster rather than the great triumph that apparently he thinks it will be, or hoped it would be. I would say that my own personal view is that calling his plan a victory plan was extremely ill-judged. No one seriously believes that Ukraine is capable of achieving a victory, a military victory in this war. In fact, I think it was in Bloomberg, I read an article which said that there is no pathway for Ukraine to victory set out in Zelensky's plan. Calling it a victory plan have simply reinforced doubts about the extent to which Zelensky himself retains a grip on reality. Now, alongside all of this, by the way, there's been a cascade of complaints, which I've seen in various Ukrainian message places about Zelensky himself. I'm not going to go through them. You can find a whole compilation of them in Simplicus the Thinker's latest blog piece on his Substack channel. He has a whole series of tweets and messages there, including from Marina Bezuglaya, but also from people like Tarigami, the Ukrainian military blogger, a rather good blogger, if I have to say. Anyway, Tarigami, seems very, very depressed about the overall military situation. Anyway, I get the sense that Ukrainians are tiring of their president as well, that they're losing whatever remaining lingering confidence they still had in him, and that, as far as they're concerned, the only reason why he is still there is because he is there, and it would require too much energy and too much effort and open up possibilities for too much destabilization to move against him. Anyway, that might be a misjudgment on my part of the mood in Kiev, but based on what I'm reading, I don't think so. Anyway, that then brings us to what is happening on the ground. And the situation on the ground, as people like Bezuglaya and Tarigami are saying, is catastrophic for Ukraine. And when I say catastrophic, Bezuglaya is now talking about the Russians establishing bridgeheads close to Zaporozhye and Dnipro and close to Kharkiv and Kherson cities by the end of this year. And she continues to say that even if this happens, Ukraine must fight on until victory. But frankly, her words conflict with the sentiments that she is expressing, because I can't really understand, I cannot see how Ukraine could win the war if the Russians did indeed reach the outskirts of Zaporozhye city and Dnipro city and Kharkiv city and Kherson city in the way that Bezuglaya says. If such a thing were to happen, as I suspect she must know, the writing for Ukraine will be on the wall. Just saying. But anyway, let's talk about the military situation. There were more Russian rocket and missile strikes against Ukraine, more drone attacks, including now by what I strongly suspect are the big Orion drones, the ones that carry the missiles, the ones that resemble, to some respect, the American Reaper and Predator drones. Anyway, there's been a lot more of this. I'm not going to try and give an assessment of the battle damage done. No doubt the Russian Defense Ministry will at some point provide their own assessment. But in the meantime, on the actual battlefronts, the situation goes from bad to worse. Now, the first and the most critical place, and the place where the biggest events are now taking place, is Vuhledar. And we now have conclusive film that confirms the presence of Russian soldiers in the eastern part of Vuhledar. The Russians have indeed broken into Vuhledar. They are inside the town, and they are fighting for control of the town. They're doing so even as the rest of the town continues to be massively bombed with huge artillery and missile and rocket strikes taking place right across the territory within Vuhledar that remains under Ukrainian control. Now, shortly before I made this video, I saw that there was another report, a report that said that alongside the acknowledged and confirmed breakthrough by the Russians into Vuhledar from the east, the Russians have also broken into Vuhledar from the west. That Russian troops have now crossed the Kashlagach River, that they've advanced to the western boundary of Vuhledar, and they have broken into the city from that direction as well. Now, if that is so, then I have to say I think it is highly likely that the fall of Vuhledar will be counted in hours or at the most in days. I cannot imagine how the Ukrainians can hold on to their positions in this relatively small by area town. The high-rise buildings, which were such an important fortified position for the Ukrainians for so long, have been basically smashed to pieces. They're in rubble. No doubt they can continue to provide some defense positions, but supply lines to Vuhledar are in effect cut. The Russians control all the main roads now. I think that there is no doubt about this. By the way, over the course of the last 24 hours, pictures have appeared of Russian soldiers with flags in every part of the coal mine South Donbas number 3, providing conclusive confirmation that the Russians are in full control of this coal mine. And the very fact that they now control the coal mine ultimately means that they must also have, at the very least, very strong fire control over the one remaining paved supply road to Vuhledar, leading northwards from Vuhledar and passing very close to the coal mine South Donbas number 3. Quite plausibly, I mean, I've not seen any reports to this effect, but quite plausibly, Russian scout parties, reconnaissance troops, have already reached this road and have already cut it. That's just to say. So that's the situation, the military situation with Vuhledar. The Ukrainians are clearly aware that Vuhledar is about to fall. I've noticed that there's a whole series of reports. I think they originate with a comment made in Washington by the Institute for the Study of War, which say that Vuhledar, the fall of Vuhledar, is not going to make any difference because the Russians having already cut all the supply roads, that means that it has lost its significance as a logistical hub. As far as I'm aware, Vuhledar has never been a logistical hub for the Ukrainian military. It has been a fortress, a very well protected and very well defended fortress, one which has withstood at least 5 previous Russian attacks, which has unbalanced, unhinged Russian offensives in this area of southwestern Donbas, and which has made it very, very difficult for the Russians to sort out their logistics in this area by opening up the neighboring railways and by moving troops northwards from Zaporozhye region towards the town of Orekhov and ultimately the city of Zaporozhye. So this is the importance that Vuhledar has held, and it continues to be its importance, even up to the moment when it finally falls. Also, of course, there is the morale effect. As I said, Vuhledar has resisted 5 attempts by the Russians to capture it. The fact that they're now about to do so will be deeply demoralizing for the Ukrainians at a time when the war is already going against them. It will seem to them, or must seem to some of them, that a formerly invincible fortress has now been breached and has fallen to the enemy. The third thing, this next thing I must say though about Vuhledar is that apparently one of the military units that is defending Vuhledar, the 46th Air Assault Brigade, paratroop force, apparently fighting alongside the 92nd Brigade, which is also located in Vuhledar. Anyway, they have apparently, and I say apparently because again I have not read this, I've seen this mentioned in third-party reports, but they have apparently, and perhaps rather bitterly, said that they have received an order that Vuhledar must be defended to the death by the Ukrainian troops located there until after the visit has ended. Now, the visit in question must be President Zelensky's visit to the United States. Now, I have not, as I said, I want to stress again, I have not read this comment, and I don't know the tone in which it was written, if of course it was written, which I believe it was. The places I have seen it refers to, I would regard as reliable. But anyway, I haven't seen the tone in which it was written, but I can't help but think or suspect that it was a very bitter one, that the soldiers in Vuhledar feel that their Supreme Commander-in-Chief, which is to say Zelensky, is abandoning them to, well, a battle in which he expects them to fight to the death for no other purpose than to maintain his prestige whilst he is in the United States. And I cannot imagine that this is going to do anything other than anger and demoralize the soldiers and, of course, their families. Now, it may not be a coincidence that the Russians, for their part, are now making claims that Ukrainian soldiers in Vuhledar, that there have been many surrenders. Now, of course, that's the Russians. Again, I don't know that this is true. I haven't seen any pictures of surrendering Ukrainian troops, but I have to say that if it is true, then it would not surprise me. To repeat finally another point which I have made, it's clear to me that the time to have evacuated Vuhledar has gone, that with the Russians now storming the town with the supply lines to Vuhledar cut off, there is really nowhere for the Ukrainian soldiers in Vuhledar to retreat to. What would have been possible a week ago almost certainly no longer is. I have to say this, but as of this moment, it seems to me as if 2 of Ukraine's best brigades, the 92nd and the 46th, have been sacrificed to no military purpose. It seems, if one believes what the 46th Brigade are saying, for only one purpose, which is to maintain President Zelensky's prestige intact whilst he goes to the United States. Anyway, that is the very, very terrible situation in Vuhledar. Now let us go a little further north, and not that far north, because to repeat again a point which I have made in many places, all of these places, the fight in Vuhledar, the fight in Kurachovo, which I'm now going to come to, the battle in Selidovo, a little further to the north, and the fighting that is now raging around Pokrovsk. All of these different battles really form one battle, one great battle being fought in southwestern Donbas as the Russian military worked to break the Ukrainian forces in southern western Donbas. They're not merely aiming to capture towns like Vuhledar, Kurachovo, Selidovo, Novogrodovka, which of course they've already captured, and Pokrovsk. Important though all of these places are, they are also aiming, in effect, to destroy the Ukrainian army located in this area. So, this morning, there were reports that the Russians have advanced in the area near Kurachovo, both from the north, both southward from Ukrainsk, presumably in the direction of the town of Girnik or Gornyak, however it's pronounced. The Ukrainians and the Russians pronounce it in different ways, but also, perhaps more importantly, from the east, that Russian forces, which recently captured Gostra, the village of Gostra, and Selidovo prison, which is located in this area, not close to Selidovo itself, as it happens, have now advanced further west and have captured another village called Ostrovia. I can't remember the name exactly, which, if true, and I want to stress, I'm not even sure definitely that it is true, and perhaps here I'm engaging in some incorrect map reading, but if true, that village is actually located on the Kurachovo reservoir. And it would mean not just that the Russians are indeed extremely close to Kurachovo itself, but that the Ukrainian forces north of Kurachovo have in effect now been surrounded. The forces that are defending themselves in Girnik, in Kurachovka, and other villages in that area. Now, that would be very dramatic news, but be aware that I might be misreading the map. And anyway, this is a report that I've seen from a secondary source, so I'm not absolutely sure whether in fact it is definitely the case. But that the Russians are advancing in this area, that is, I think, now indisputable. There's also reports that whatever Ukrainian forces are still located in the fields north of Krasnogorovka and west of Novolskoye now are definitely surrounded, though I doubt actually that there are any Ukrainian troops in those fields. And a little further north, it seems that the Russians have advanced westwards from Ukrainsk, which the government of the Russian-backed government of the Donetsk People's Republic, now incorporated into Russia, have now formally confirmed is under Russian control. Anyway, there are reports that the Russians have pushed west from Ukrainsk, captured a coal mine located to the west of Ukrainsk, that they're pushing towards the village of Tsukorinye, which is located to the south of Selidovo. And there are also reports that Russian troops advancing from the north have also outflanked Selidovo from the north. And Ukrainian sources are now speaking of Selidovo as having been surrounded on three sides, having been taken, in effect, into a semicircle. And I saw a report, again from a Ukrainian source today. You can find it on Simplicus the Thinker's blog, on his Substack. On Substack, he reproduces it there, that the Ukrainians are now actually thinking of withdrawing from Selidovo and Toretsk and Kurachovo, that all of these places should be abandoned because they've all become undefendable. Well, I have to say that the Ukrainians withdrawing from a place like Selidovo would be completely out of character. I expect they will, in fact, continue to fight there. If there's a serious risk that they will be completely encircled, maybe at that point a decision will be made to withdraw. But I doubt that we're at that point yet. I'm going to guess that several days, perhaps a week or two, of serious fighting awaits us before Selidovo finally falls to the Russians. But the trajectory of travel is very clear. I can't see how the Ukrainians can turn things round. They are clearly losing now the battle for Selidovo. Even the Ukrainians themselves admit as much. And further north still, the Russians continue to bomb and shell Pokrovsk and Mirnograd. There are more reports that the Russians are storming the village of Nikolaevka, located north of Kruty Yar and Krasny Yar, the two small villages to the northeast of Novogrodivka. And the Russians are now, as I said, storming the village of Nikolaevka. And it's been pointing out that if they do storm Nikolaevka, there is only one inhabited settlement north of Nikolaevka, and that is Mirnograd itself. The way would be open for the Russians to launch an assault on Mirnograd. And a number of people, including, by the way, the Military Summary channel, have pointed out that even as of now, there is no fortified system created by the Ukrainians to defend Mirnograd and Pokrovsk. There are Ukrainian troops in some number in Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, but they have not yet established, or have not established, a stable defense system, a system of effective fortifications, such as might hold the Russians back or prolong a storming of this urban conurbation. So, a very, very bad situation there too, one which is deteriorating. I remember that about a week ago we were hearing claims and reports about some sort of stabilization of the situation around Pokrovsk and Selidovo. I didn't believe that at the time, and I think we can see now that all those claims or hopes, there were some people I know who did hope it, but all of those claims and hopes have been shown to be wrong and untrue. Anyway, there we are. Now, further east, there's been, perhaps because the events in Vuhledar and Selidovo and Pokrovsk have been so dramatic, there's been less information about the situation in Toretsk. Let me repeat again what I said yesterday. My point is that if the Russians really are in a position where they're storming an industrial area, central Toretsk, which was expected to be held for a long time by the Ukrainians, to the point where the Ukrainians are themselves demolishing tall buildings to prevent them falling under Russian control. Well, if that really is the case, and it wasn't the Russians who destroyed this building, perhaps by bombing it, but as I said yesterday, there are people who can tell the difference, and they say that this building was demolished by internally planted explosives. Anyway, if it is really the case, then the Russians have pressed far deeper into Toretsk than any mapping project acknowledges, and presumably that pace of advance will continue, and it would not surprise me if we suddenly found that the situation of the Ukrainians in Toretsk has deteriorated to a far greater extent than any independent blogger, reporting channel, be it Russian or Ukrainian or Western, acknowledges. Just to say. And I think the same is true about Chasiv Yar, about which we're also hearing very little, and it's also true about Siversk. There is an awful lot of information coming out, trickling out about what's going on in the Liman direction, that is the area of the Zherebets River, where the Russians continue their operation to clear the villages around the Zherebets River. I discussed this in detail yesterday, and there is also continuing information about the fighting around Kupiansk, south of Kupiansk, along the Oskol River. I'm not going to devote a huge amount of any time to this today, because all I will say is that the reports we're getting are of continuing Russian advances, but they're not such as I think it would be. There would be much point for me to discuss them. They just confirm the already existing trajectory of travel, which is that the eastern banks of both of these rivers are falling under Russian control. And in the case of the Zherebets River, which is close to Liman, the Russians have already established bridgeheads on the west, on the Ukrainian controlled West Bank. But we have had some rather interesting news from Volchansk. Now, a couple of days ago, Group of Forces North informed us that they had captured most of the high-rise building area in Volchansk. And on the basis of that, I said that it looked to me as if the Battle of Volchansk was about to end, and that the Russians were finally close to ending the Battle of Volchansk. Well, either Group of Forces North was lying, which, by the way, Russian military units, the Russian military can sometimes be, well, let's say economical with the truth, or possibly there have been developments inside Volchansk, which I don't fully understand, but Group of Forces North has confirmed today that they have withdrawn completely from the aggregate plant south of the area of the high-rise buildings. This is an area which is massively fought over, and the Ukrainians, for their part, have released film showing their soldiers in the aggregate plant unfurling their flags there. So this is one place on the battle lines where the Russians have retreated. Now, there are all sorts of claims all over the Russian side of the internet that this was all a cunning plan, a carefully laid trap, that the Russians deliberately withdrew from the territory of the aggregate plant because the aggregate plant has been completely obliterated and that there is nothing really there to fight over, and that by allowing the Ukrainians to enter the grounds of the aggregate plant, the Russians can drop massive amounts of bombs and shells and thermobaric warheads and all of that kind of thing on them, and inflict massive losses on the Ukrainians. And I have to say, there have been instances where the Russians have done that. I remember way back in 2022, at the start of the special military operation, a US Marine officer who wrote under the pen name Marinus wrote a piece for the US Marine Corps Journal in which he spoke about how the Russians are in the practice of laying fire traps. They withdraw from particular positions, lure their enemy in, and then launch massive fire on territory that they have charted and plotted exhaustively so that they're able to cover every square meter of ground. So if the Russians have pulled back and laid a trap for the Ukrainians, well, as I said, it would not be unprecedented. And as I said, American Marine officers have written about this, and it is a known Russian tactic. However, it seems to me that it is at least as plausible that a group of forces north, which has its hands full fighting in Kursk as well, and which is also pushing forward towards Kharkiv city in the Lipsy area, has decided that, for the moment at least, the Battle of Volchansk can wait. They've secured some positions, perhaps in the area of the high-rise buildings. Maybe the aggregate plant is not quite as important as it was a few weeks ago, and having redeployed some of their forces and also sent many of their supplies to fight the Ukrainians further west in Kursk region, well, that in light of that, it might have made sense for them to pull back from the aggregate plant and allow it to fall back under Ukrainian control in the confident knowledge that at some point the Russians will return and will be able to take the whole of Volchansk under their control. So I have to say I lean much more to that view than to the theory that it was any kind of trap or cunning plan or anything of that kind. But then, as I always say, the Russian military do not share their plans with me. I'm not also on the ground. I'm not absolutely sure what is going on, except one thing, that the Russians have pulled out of the aggregate plant and the Ukrainians have occupied it. Now, elsewhere, however, the group of forces north continues to move forward. They claim that in the Kursk area they've advanced a further 2 kilometers. Again, they don't explain where or how or in what way. There were the reports that appeared yesterday that Malaya Loknya, the village north of Suja, has fallen under Ukrainian control. Again, I have seen no evidence at all, by which I mean no photographic or film evidence that confirms that this is the case. And group of forces north, by the way, as of the time of making of this program, have said nothing about it. But group of forces north are saying that their men have now reached Plekhovo, village to the south of Suja, southeast of Suja, on the Ukrainian border, close to the main road between Suja and the Ukrainian city of Sumy, the road the Ukrainians use to transport supplies to their forces in Kursk region. And, well, there's also, as I discussed in other previous programs, reports that the Russians are now very close to another village, Selidovo, which is located to the west of this road. And I said this, if the Russians capture these two villages, Plekhovo and Selidovo, then the Ukrainians in Kursk run the very real risk of being completely cut off. And that would be a disaster for Ukraine. It will be a disaster for Ukraine if they fail to pull their troops out of what I suspect before very long is going to be the Kurachovo cauldron or pocket in southwestern Donbas. There's suggestions that there's around 20,000 Ukrainian troops in this area. If these troops all find themselves surrounded, it would be a catastrophic disaster for Ukraine. I've heard that the total size of the Ukrainian forces that are operating in the Sumy and Kursk area numbers around 30,000 men. Obviously, not all of them are in Kursk, but presumably a significant proportion are, shall we say, between 10 and 15,000. If they're cut off and surrounded and have to surrender or fight to the death, well, that also will be a major disaster for Ukraine. Its army is overextended. This is acknowledged by all objective reporters of the war, including many Ukrainian. Its army is overextended, it is exhausted, it is running short of supplies and equipment. They cannot afford to lose men in this sort of number, either in Kurakovo or in Kursk. Bad military decisions to fight for every millimeter of territory, be it in Kursk region, or in Kurakovo, or in Svedliko, or rather in Selidovo, or of course in Vuhledar, and perhaps ultimately Pokrovsk. Bad decisions of this kind are opening up the possibilities for this kind of disaster. And this mirrors identical bad decisions that were made in Bakhmut, in Mariupol, in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, where again the Ukrainians sacrificed huge numbers of men to defend undefendable ground. Well, there it is. We will see what the military and political consequences will be in Ukraine if anything like that does happen. And we will also see whether the Ukrainians allow that to happen, whether instead they will break with their own precedent and decide to withdraw from all of these places rather than abandon the men in them to their fate. Anyway, now the Russians have been making comments of their own about proposals for negotiations, and the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, Putin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, has again repeated the observation that if deep strikes with Western missiles are made against Russia, he said that everything was set out by Putin in the statement he gave about 2 weeks ago, that the Russians would regard that as an act of war by whichever Western powers were involved in those missile strikes. And the Russians have also made statements that it would be oppressive, it would be unjust and oppressive if they were forced into negotiations which they didn't believe in and which could only have a deeply unsatisfactory outcome. Now, I've seen this reported in TASS. Again, I'm not able to find the actual citation, but my recollection is that this comment was made by an official at a member of Russia's delegation to the United Nations for the General Assembly meeting. And by the way, that delegation is now headed by none other than Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who will, of course, be in New York at the same time that all the Western leaders will be there, and Zelensky will be there. And presumably, if the Western powers want to talk to Lavrov, well, they can do so, though I doubt myself that any will. Now, perhaps even more consequentially, Russia's ambassador to the UN, Vasily Nebenzia, has now come out and has made a statement that any peace proposals that do not address the problem of the cancer, as he described it, at the heart of the crisis, and by cancer he meant what he referred to as the regime in Kiev, that is to say, Zelensky's government, that any such plan that fails to address this problem is not going to be acceptable to the Russians, and for that reason will not succeed. Now, the Russians have at various times made statements, all but confirming that regime change is now their objective in Ukraine. Perhaps Nebenzia is not the most authoritative person to look for a comment like that. It would not be as significant, perhaps, or consequential if something like this was said by Putin himself, or by Shoigu, or Lavrov, or somebody at that level. But then Nebenzia is a serious and important diplomat. He's representing Russia at the United Nations. He is Russia's point of contact with the international community, and he is the Russian official, Russian diplomat, who has more interactions, I suspect, with senior diplomats of the Western powers than any other. I personally would take this comment of Nebenzia's extremely seriously, as I take all his comments. Anyway, there we are. Now, this is the general situation today. Zelensky's victory plan has proved very unimpressive. As I said, I think it's backfiring on its creator. I think the West is unimpressed by it. I think they don't like the way in which they probably feel that Zelensky is trying to basically push them towards decisions like an accelerated NATO entry for Ukraine, which the Western powers have effectively ruled out. And the Russians, my sense is that after the brief period when, to their great irritation, they found that the Brazilians and the Indians had come back and were badgering them to begin negotiations with the Ukrainians, the Russians again feel that the pressure is off, and that explains why Nebenzia, for example, is able to make the statements about regime change in Kiev that he has. So there we are. Now, before I continue, I do want to mention one particular intrigue, which is that there's been an article in Reuters which purportedly quotes the Iranian President Pezeshkian, as talking about Russian aggression in Ukraine. Now, within hours, very quickly after that report appeared in Reuters, the Iranian foreign minister said that no such statement, no such comment had actually been made by President Pezeshkian, and that the Reuters story was fake. Well, I don't speak Farsi. I don't follow everything that President Pezeshkian says. I can't confirm what the Iranian foreign minister says. I'm a little surprised, if it was fake, that President Pezeshkian himself has not come out to contradict this comment. But anyway, the very fact that the foreign minister has contradicted it shows, or confirms rather, that it is not the view of the Iranian government. Now, the British media fairly recently was publishing a whole raft of stories connected with the assassinations of the Hamas political chief Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. Stories which appeared mostly, as I remember, in the Daily Telegraph, which I analysed in very great detail when they appeared, and which I said I didn't believe, that they didn't make any kind of sense to me, that they assumed that they seemed to be based on briefings by Iranian officials of the Daily Telegraph, which is one of the most fervently pro-Israeli newspapers in Britain. And I didn't believe that any Iranian official, if they wanted to leak a story to the media, the Western media, would choose the Telegraph to leak it to, if only because doing so would put them at serious risk domestically from their Iranian critics. And I also expressed the view that these stories appeared to me to be intended to stir dissension within Iran, between President Pezeshkian and the other authorities in Iran. And subsequently, Glenn Deason and myself did a program with the former British diplomat Alistair Crook, who is, of course, far more familiar with Iran than I am. And he explained why, for all kinds of structural reasons, for hierarchical reasons, it would be impossible for President Pezeshkian to be doing some of the things, reaching out to the West and the rest, that those articles in the Daily Telegraph appear to be alleging that he was doing. So here now we have another article from Reuters talking about Pezeshkian, talking about Russian aggression in Ukraine, an article that has appeared a few weeks after those previous articles in the Daily Telegraph. And again, I don't know for a fact what is going on, but to me, it looks as if someone in London is trying to create trouble for President Pezeshkian and within the Iranian government at a time of great political crisis, feeding doubts about President Pezeshkian's loyalty to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which he was supposedly in quarrel with, according to the articles in the Daily Telegraph, and feeding doubts about President Pezeshkian with Russians who would presumably not be happy to have their operation in Ukraine described as aggression. Anyway, I cannot categorically refute this story. Pezeshkian has been known to make statements which do suggest that he would like to see an improvement in Iran's relations with the West. It may be that he did say something negative about the Russians, though I have to say that would surprise me, given that he's been meeting senior Russian officials quite a lot recently, most specifically Sergei Shoigu, the former defense minister and secretary of Russia's Security Council, and that Iran appears to be on the brink of signing a strategic partnership agreement with Russia, one apparently negotiated mostly with Shoigu. So it would surprise me. I think it most unlikely. It seems to me, as I said, that someone in London is out to make trouble between the Iranians and the Russians, and between the various factions or supposed factions in Tehran. And I think that is what all of these various articles in the Daily Telegraph and The Guardian are actually telling us. Then again, I might be wrong. Maybe there are more intrigues going on in Tehran than I can possibly guess at. But I would say this: if President Pezeshkian really is trying to distance Iran from the Russians and is referring to the Russians as aggressors, if he is indeed quarrelling with Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, then he's taking on an awful lot of enemies in a very short time, and I wonder how long he will remain president of Iran. But to repeat again, I don't personally believe that any of this is happening. Anyway, If you come across these reports, which perhaps you will, Simplicus the Thinker, in that same blog piece that I mentioned when I spoke about the various comments made by Ukrainian commentators and soldiers critical of the Ukrainian leadership. In that very same piece, I noticed that Simplicus the Thinker extensively covers these purported comments of President Pezeshkian's, and despite recording the Iranian denial, he appears to lend some credence to the claims that President Pezeshkian did indeed say these things. I don't, for the reason which I have said. Anyway, that is my video for today. It's a little shorter than yesterday's, but, well, it's still, I think, of a, shall we say, common length for me, or at least a not uncommon length for me. Anyway, this is where I finish today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Don't forget that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.